Okay, I'll follow your lead.
Okay, I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our fourth webinar in this series. And I think quite a much anticipated one. I think we've delved into the different styles of wine, Cabernets from South Africa, old gems of South Africa, the Old Vine Project. But I think today is quite an interesting topic as well. It's looking at a brand and the value of a brand, and how does that, or does it differ from a wine brand versus a spirits brand, or versus a lot more of a household name? So we're going to toss a couple of questions around between Mike and Jeremy. Yeah, so I really think this will also give the bidder even more tools to know what he's bidding on the day, on the 22nd of May. And I think that will give his armor almost. What is a brand? Do I buy for investment? Do I buy for enjoyment? But now you've got a full armor to make that decision, and quite an informed decision. So today, Jeremy Sampson and Mike Ratcliffe is going to be hosting the webinar and going to give and impart knowledge to all our customers and bidders out there. So yeah, I think Mike Ratcliffe has been in the forefront of making, promoting and driving South African wine in the industry. And it's quite an outspoken leader in his field. We also always love a little bit of a pushing the status quo and making things better for everyone. So that's always a good thing. And Jeremy Sampson, a guru with 50 years of experience in marketing, advertising, graphic design, public relations, reputational management, and branding, and has claimed many awards, notably the prestigious Financial Mail Ad Focus Lifetime Achievements Award, and amongst many others. He's also an avid, knowledgeable wine lover and collector. So I think between Jeremy and Mike, we're going to have a fantastic and a robust conversation about wine, about branding, and about wine branding. So if I can say interact, please ask questions. We will field the questions at the end of the webinar, but if it's topical and Mike and or Jeremy is talking about something that the question is asking about, then I'll just raise my hand and then come in and field the question. But both you and Mike, you can both see the questions on your screen as well if you just scroll down. But with no further ado, the floor is yours, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Shall I kick off, Mike, and just say thank you to be here and a privilege to be involved. Branding across all sectors, not just wine, is about building something that can be registered in law and which people will actually seek out. Basically, you've got to have awareness, you've got to have interest, you've got to create desire, and then you want to create adoption. And that sounds basic, but that's what branding is about. And then a really strong brand adds huge value. Now, I hope there are a lot of people who are lusting after buying some of the things listed at your auction. They have that desire. Whether they have the affordability, that's another matter. But a lot of people seem to think that brands are not important when it comes to wine. They think of cultivars and they think of commodities. I don't care what cultivar it is. The first thing I want to know is where it comes from. And that's the provenance. Who can I trust? And this is something that Mike knows a lot about as well. So Mike, I'm not going to hog this. You chip in now.
Well, what a pleasure to be on the same platform as you, Mr. Sampson, a guru indeed. As we drill the concept of brand onto the wine industry and indeed the beverage industry, let's call it that, I completely agree with you that brand is everything. Without brand, you are nothing, floating, trying to swim upstream, if ever there was a metaphor like that. Trying to, at some stage during this conversation, we'll try to differentiate between luxury brands, collectible brands, investable brands. But all of these represent the pinnacle of the pyramid. Ultimately, you have to build something to get there. And in my opinion, one of the greatest strengths of top brands is that they are able to represent something, that they're able to be focused. That often I say to brand owners, for goodness sakes, people, pick something, get good at it, become the best, and then become famous. But too often in the wine industry, everybody is trying to be everything. And so a brand, the strongest brands usually are easily identifiable and easily definable. And so that you should be able to say in 10 or 15 words, what is a brand? I like to ask the question, who am I when I refer to a brand? I'm sure that applies to not just wine, but also many other categories, Jeremy.
Well, absolutely. And when we talk about the value of a brand, of course, there are two values. There's the financial value. In other words, if I want to buy a brand and own it, how much am I prepared to pay? So it's a financial side, but there's the emotional one as well. If you're having a really good dinner with a nice hog of beef or a roast leg of lamb, what would you like to have sitting on your table in the middle? And Mike's going to chip in here and say, a nice bottle of Vilafonté. Well, that's fine. But this is where, also a brand gives you bragging rights as well. What brands do you relate to? What do you seek out? Listening to Michael and Benny in the webinar a week ago, there was a lot of Zonneblom looking there on the table. And to some people, they'll say that's an old brand, but most famous brands, most top brands have a heritage. They've been around a long time. People say, as Mike's just said, let's look at perhaps outside of wine to beverages or whatever. But Johnny Walker's 200 years this year, and 200 years. The top wines by value, as ranked by the group I'm with, Brand Finance, are champagne brands. And if I say to you that Moët & Chandon is valued at $1.4 billion US, Johnny Walker, a spirit, of course, is valued at $4 billion US. $4 billion for a brand. Now that's the world we live in. We're playing here at the feet of giants.
So Dom Perignon has been making champagne and nothing else. Johnny Walker has been making whiskey and nothing else. They've remained true to their cause, true to their purpose. As you mentioned in an earlier conversation, they might make slightly different flavors. Johnny Walker might make slightly different flavors or ages or nuanced versions of their Johnny Walker, but it still comes in a Johnny Walker box under the Johnny Walker brand. And they very cleverly differentiated it by color. And perhaps this is a lesson that certainly South African brand owners can take, is that too much of anything is bad. Fragmenting your message and fragmenting your product offering or portfolio basically means that you're trying to tell too many stories, and too many stories don't stick. Going back to fragmentation in South Africa, depending on who you ask, there are something like 10,000 unique brands or SKUs, as they're sometimes referred to. And also, depending on how you define it, there are something like 700 producers in South Africa. Yet, how many true brands are there really? And there's only a handful of brands that are fragmented, that are successful. Generally, they've adopted a bulldozer effect where they just take a huge amount of money and throw money behind it. But if you look at the common denominator of great wine brands around the world, invariably they are highly defined, highly specialized. If you go to California, Opus One, Screaming Eagle, Harlan, these are producers that produce one wine. If you go to Bordeaux and look at the first growth and even the second growths, in general, they're producing one wine, a second wine, and then on occasion a third wine. But that's it. It's very tight. Whereas there appears to be a tendency in South Africa to have a portfolio of 5, maybe 10, and in many cases 50 wines under a brand, which just makes it really difficult. And Jeremy, you were speaking about your experience with perfume.
Yes, I think some people think, oh, don't talk to me about other things other than wine or spirits or beers, but you can learn an awful lot from other sectors. You were saying with whiskey, just the packaging, but most of the guys on this call will have bought a perfume at some stage or other, whether it's going through duty free or whatever. And when you actually look at the packaging, the cost of the packaging, the layers, the corrugated card around it, etc., etc. And what are you paying? I haven't traveled for the last 18 months, and I'm sure most of you haven't, but you're probably paying from about 600, I don't know, 700 rands a pop upwards. And you get this minute little bottle when you actually undo all the packaging, and inside is a bit of liquid, and it's got a bit of a smell, sure, and it's got a bit of color, but unless you put a label on it which says something like Chanel, you don't know what you're buying. And this is where I think sometimes with wine as well, wine could learn from that. It's not just a bottle, it's not just a label, it's the packaging, it's the box, it's dressing it up. Does it have a cork, or is it screw cap? Does it have a wax top or whatever? What kind of bottle is it? And this is where, as you say, Mike, you're absolutely right. You have all these brand cues. Now, when you talk color, if you talk champagne, if I say yellow, most people will know it's Veuve Clicquot. Right, name one wine in South Africa that's taken ownership of a color, because I can't. And this is where little cues like that make all the difference to the buying decisions. Mike, I'm sure you've got some added thoughts to that.
I do, and you're quite right. I mean, the stories of how Taittinger and Veuve Clicquot have owned their colors are legendary around the world. I mean, there are some very strong emerging brands in South Africa, and make no mistake, quality is a key criteria. Something my mom always taught me is that you can sell anything expensive once, but it's the repeat purchase that truly is where greatness rests. So what I've noticed in South Africa, that there are a huge number and a growing number of wineries, sometimes very large wineries, where they select their, let's say, according to the winemaker, they select their best barrel, put it in a heavy bottle with a fancy cork and a fancy label, give it a fancy brand, and give it a fancy price. And that's all very well, and I wouldn't want to discourage that. But ultimately, the wine has to taste amazing. And that also brings me to the question of significance and relevance. Making one barrel of wine does not a brand make. In order to truly develop a brand, there actually has to be some stock availability. There has to be, even if there's only 1,000 fine wine collectors in South Africa, each one of them should at least be able to get a bottle or perhaps a case. But in order to achieve brand recognition and brand strength globally, almost every high-end fine wine brand in South Africa still remains too small. And the challenge is going to be to scale to size where you can actually supply the markets that demand fine wines around the world. So significance and relevance of production are very important. And going back to your perfume analogy, Jeremy, that bottle of Chanel that you bought at duty free is probably made in batches of 1 million bottles at a time.
You're absolutely right. And I have to say, nothing worse than buying a bottle of something that looked a genuine article in Nairobi and getting it home and bringing it home, and my wife opening it and she was saying, this is fake, which brings us to another aspect as well, because when you're spending a lot of money at an auction, you want to know the provenance, you want to know that the brand is what it says it is. And you're using the word relevant a lot, which I totally agree with. If any brand anywhere in the world does not stay relevant, it's out of touch. You also mentioned your mother, and I have to say the first person who ever spoke to me in the wine industry in South Africa about brands and value was your dear mother. And I joke, Mike, but I think you were still in nappies at the time. It was that long ago. She understood totally. And you can pick up in a conversation only a few seconds if someone knows or if someone doesn't know. The other thing, of course, about a brand is consistency. We say that when you buy any brand, and whatever it is, you want it to be consistent. Now, I understand that that is sometimes a challenge in the wine industry. Things are going to move around a little bit and change. That's why sometimes, of course, the top chateaus in France don't produce every year. No, sometimes they'll skip a vintage. Or sometimes, of course, you have a second label, which you can use, but you keep the main brand always strong. So you've got to stay relevant with all your audiences, and that's a challenge, especially with lots and lots of young people in South Africa. and also the racial mix. You know, we should be appealing more to younger black drinkers, and it's good to see some of the promotions in places like Soweto that are doing that. But you've got to have a consistency. Now, one of the sayings about a brand, any brand, is a promise made and a promise kept. And I think in our lives, that's not a bad mantra either. But this is where, Mike, you've been promising and delivering for actually quite a long time.
Well, I'm actually just made a note of that, a promise made and a promise kept. I like it. I'm going to use that over and over again. And I hope everyone else...
It's copyrighted, don't worry.
I hope everyone else out there wrote this down, because that's a great one. Yeah, I mean, consistency of everything, Jeremy. It's not just quality. It's consistency of communication, packaging, delivery, positioning, and at least making sure that your messaging is on cue, nonstop, into the future. And consistency isn't about making sure that what you say today is the same as what you say in 3 months. It's about making sure that consistency happens over a very long time. And there, I go back to that classic brand, Dom Perignon. If you go back and have a look at their label 20 years ago and 50 years ago, it's identical. There's been no change. Sure, there may have been a slight improvement in paper and technology, and the ink industry might have improved, but to the consumer, it's indistinguishable. If you look at a Canoncorp label, the label now compared to the label 30 years ago, it's still the same. There might have been some tweaks, but extremely identifiable, and you know, that speaks to consistency. I think just going back to the consistency in quality, that's a slightly different version, because if you look back at the general quality level of fine wine, if there was such a thing 30 years ago in South Africa, there were obviously winners and losers, high quality, medium quality, and low quality. But the highest quality 20 or 30 years ago might not be acceptable to the consumer of today. So consistency is important, but consistency of improvement might also be a valuable characteristic for a brand as it seeks to penetrate the upper echelons of the fine wine industry. And certainly, just going, not to hog the limelight, Jeremy, but just to go back to your comment about provenance. Provenance is very important, but if you are producing a wine today that you either aspire to join the stratosphere of fine wine, or you are already playing the fine wine game, every time you release a bottle today, you need to actually be planning for the potential sale of that bottle in 10, possibly 20 years time. And so even if provenance is very easy to prove today, the question is, how will I prove provenance in 20 years? And how will I protect today against potential significant increase in value of that bottle over the next 20 years, which will make it much more attractive to faking and forgery?
You're absolutely right. And I think there was a lot of talk about a certain gentleman in Germany who was faking a lot of DRC and making a fortune out of it. And then more and more cases were appearing around the world. And I guess this is where that starts kicking in. If you're buying a bottle for more than, shall we say, 12, 1500 rands, you're now getting up into the luxury class. And that's where it becomes worthwhile for fakers to be doing things. That's where, when you have an auction such as this, you know the provenance, you can trust it, it has integrity, so you know that you're buying the right thing. I am a very modest collector of wine, and the first time I really drank wine as a student in Bordeaux was at Chateau Palmer, sitting outside having lunch with Mr. Peter C. Schell, who was a magnificent gentleman. And I still have, well, I have today, a bottle of about a 1968 Chateau Palmer tucked away. And I have to say, I'm a very modest collector and very few wines. But now I'm looking for an occasion to open it. And what will it be like? At least I know, coming from Chateau Palmer, that it has that integrity and that provenance. But this is where, when you look at some of the local producers, and you've mentioned Canoncorp, and that to me stands out head and shoulders, a lot of the other producers don't seem to understand that the qualities you and I have been talking about, Mike: integrity, consistency, quality, and focus, focus, focus and keep it simple and be known for just a couple of things like Hamilton Russell or people like that. And when you look at the labels of these top brands as well, because most to me are not brands, they're labels, or they're a B, a lowercase b, they haven't become brands that people are going to seek out and look for. And this is where this auction is an opportunity to do just that.
Yeah, quite right. I think that South Africa is in its infancy in terms of evolving into the space where fine wine is a thing. If you were to go offshore and speak to that vast diaspora of millions of people that are actually fine wine collectors that are willing to spend tens of thousands of rands per bottle, and certainly more than that per case, very few of them would yet identify South Africa as a serious player in the fine wine space. Having said that, it is changing at a breakneck speed. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the change at the top end of the South African wine market has been astonishing, and I see absolutely no reason why it's going to change. But in the same way that all the spoils in the American wine auction market, whether it's investable or collectible, are all taken by the top 20 wines, not wineries. In Bordeaux, you know, it's going to be the top 10 wines that take all the action. And so I think what would be great is if the South African wine market could evolve more broadly, so that we have a wider set of shoulders to support the rest of the industry, so that it's not just a handful of wines that become investable and collectible.
I think you're absolutely right. I did find it very interesting, as I mentioned, listening to Michael and Benny about the different tastes, if I can use that common word, of old wines. You know, whether it's slightly musty or whatever, slightly herbaceous, I think Michael used that word. And this is where things change. I once had the privilege of having supper with the Australian gentleman who came out and worked with KWV, Richard Rowe, and we went through an evening together, and then at the end of the evening he pulled out, I think it was a 1930 something KWV, I think it was a Muscadel or something like that, and he said, we've still got a treasure trove at KWV of old fine wines. And I don't know if that's still the case there, but we still have things to celebrate, as you're saying, Michael. You know, the Delheims and people like that. Again, working in the past with Rebel Bottle Store. Do you remember Rebel, part of Gilbey's? And Trevor Pearman was the MD, and he was retiring. And I said, well, when you're next up in Johannesburg, I'll take you out for dinner, because we had worked together and had a very good working relationship. And he said, right, you can buy the dinner and I'll bring the wine. And what did he bring? A bottle of Delheim. And it was absolutely stunning, an absolute stunner.
Nice. Jeremy, I noticed that our time is running out rather rapidly as predicted, but there was 1 or 2 rather interesting questions that came through. And the very first question was, South African branding agencies like Wines of South Africa have been marketing South Africa's biggest asset as diversity in our terroir and wines. And the fact that wineries can make so many different wines on one property, are you suggesting this message should change? So perhaps you could take a stab at that first, because I know that I have a firm opinion on it.
Well, I think that any brand has to have a unique proposition. Is our diversity a unique proposition? As you said, the choice at the moment is so wide, so widespread, that there's a total lack of focus. Is Wose's positioning strong enough to actually gain traction? Is it successful? From what I'm seeing and from what I'm hearing and talking to you as well, it is not gaining traction. In the States, for instance, they hardly have heard of South Africa, let alone its wines. So I think we need to rethink, but this is where people need to start pulling together and working together. There is so much fragmentation at the moment, and when people are trying to be, as you said earlier, all things to all people, they lack that focus. You've got to be very single-minded here, and I think they need to relook their strategy. But your thoughts?
Yeah, Wines of South Africa is a representative body funded by levies paid by every wine producer in the country that deems that wants to export wine. So Wines of South Africa does have to represent the entire industry, one could argue they have to represent the average industry. And I would argue that the average industry does not participate in auctions like the Cape Fine and Rare Wine auction. So these messages need to be different, unfortunately. I don't think that filling the shelves in Tesco and selling a case of a vintage wine at the Cape Fine and Rare Wine auction, I don't think there is enough commonality between those things. They're so far apart that it would be very difficult to bundle that into one message. Having said that, diversity is a tough sell, I would suggest. And yeah, I would certainly like to see some changes to that, but it is difficult. Too many communication messages means that you say nothing.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And this is where, when you look at the Australians, when you talk Australia, I think you talk Penfold, and that group is headed up by a South African. He went and worked overseas in marketing and finance, and he's gone back. Well, he's gone to Australia now, and it's a huge success. We need our own heroes. We need perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 top brands produced in the sort of scale as you've mentioned, because we've got to think global here. And the minute you start creating global brands, you change. Just to go back to beer, working with South African breweries, as I was in 1997, 98, it was a small South African producer, like a lot of wine producers. But then Graham Mackay had the vision to say, if we're going to be serious players, we need to go international. And that's, of course, what he did. It was the end of apartheid as well, so he could move more freely, but he started buying up brands and more brands. And if I say to you, and I've got the figure in front of me, when SA Breweries was sold to Anheuser-Busch, it was sold for 1.6 trillion rands. Now, he thought big, and I think this is where the South African wine industry needs to start thinking bigger, and then get really big later on.
Yeah, we do have some very strong brands. We don't have, I don't believe, a single global brand, but domestically, brands like Rupert and Rothschild, are doing big volume, but they're doing it at a reasonably good price, but they don't seem to have aspirations for the top end of the market. And they don't have aspirations for global domination. Chocolate Block is doing a remarkably good job, also producing big volumes. But within the context of an auction like we've got here, you do have brands like De Wetzelhof that they've really stamped their name on Chardonnay, and that is a unique selling point. Well done to De Wetzelhof for actually picking something, being bloody good at it, stamping their name on it, and developing a reputation. Which leads me actually to a question. 2 questions. One question was, talking of consistency and quality, are the wines on offer at the Cape Fine and Rare Wine auction South Africa's best example of South Africa's finest wine brands? I mean, my answer would be yes, because essentially the wines were chosen by the wineries, and as a commercial auction, the wineries were asked to delve deep, and also were asked not to present many lots. They were said, just bring us your best. And so I think it's fairly likely that this does represent a very high quality selection of South Africa's finest wine brands.
But then that means that we're showcasing our best. Are we making sure that the punters and the important people, not just in South Africa, but around the world, are going to take notice? Mike, you know better than me the challenge that California had to challenge the French and how they went about it with some success. But I almost think we need that moment in South Africa. We need to make sure that people around the world are aware of our wines, aware of the quality and the fine wines, and get them involved. I know we get people coming in from the UK quite often, but we don't seem to get anyone from the States or wider across the world. And of course, at the moment, there are huge opportunities. I think the Chinese, especially over the last decade or so, have been buying up fine wines. And it'd be interesting to know if, in fact, you're going to have any Chinese bidders at the auctions.
Yeah, that's going to be the collective team effort that is required. I do see we're running out of time, and I also see that I'm getting the nod, but I would like to just take 10 seconds to give a brief summary, certainly from my perspective, is that I think certainly at the top end of the South African wine industry, we are creating a halo effect. There are a limited number of brands that are really punching above their weight at the top end and creating a halo effect for the entire industry. We should be super proud of that, and we should ensure as an industry that we avoid the tall poppy syndrome, which could be a very bad thing, where jealousy within the industry starts pulling down the top brands. People that are achieving 10,000 or 100,000 Rand a bottle or a case, or numbers that in the past might have seemed ludicrous. We need to celebrate them because they lift up the entire industry. And there are very few platforms. The Cape Fine and Rare is one of those platforms. It is purely supply and demand driven. And if somebody does successfully, really, really well, we should be absolutely celebrating that and shouting it from the top of the hills.
Well, I'm going to echo that as well. I know we're running out of time, but we need to work together. It's like so many things in South Africa. We're often too fragmented. There's power in being together. Imagine the Springboks as 15, as the tight 8. They're so much more potent than if they're fragmented. And we have so much to celebrate. But when people turn around and say, oh, they don't know about us in the States or whatever, well, whose fault is it? It's actually our fault. So this is where we've got to, I think, I totally agree, Mike, we've got to refocus the strategy, make it much simpler, tightly focused, and then get on and do it.
I couldn't have said it better. Jeremy and Mike, I concur. I completely agree what you were saying in this webinar. I definitely think we need as an industry work together just to achieve more. And applaud and stop and celebrate our successes. We don't ever do that enough, I think. We run away to, but we could have done this better and we should have done that better. Just stop and say, well, bloody done. You have done a great job, and then take on the next obstacle or the next challenge that comes our way. But the Cape Fine and Rare Wine Auction is definitely that industry platform where we want to lift our wines and to showcase to the world, and not just in South Africa, what is the best of the best that can come out of South Africa, and why the rest of the world needs to take note of what we can offer. So thank you so much for a great conversation. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that made notes as we went along. So thank you so much for that. And if you haven't seen any of the webinars, they're all on social media. So you can go and revisit and re-look at the webinars that we've got available there. Really great conversation pieces. And if you haven't registered for the auction, whether you want to be there in person or online, we're going to have a web streaming from the Rupert Museum in Stellenbosch. Limited seats though, but we have done a lot of work internationally as well to make the auction relevant and to put ourselves out there for the market. So go and visit capefineandrarewine.auction and register. So thank you so much, guys, and thank you so much for joining us for the conversation. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.